For this project, I'll be making a raised dog food tray for Polly. For the material, I'll be using some old cedar that used to be part of an outdoor swing set. I picked up some large dog food bowls from Dollar General and measured the top to get the diameter to see how many board sections I would need. The boards were a little over 5¼ inches, so the top will have to be 3 pieces. So I sketched up a quick idea for the build layout, and like most of my sketches, none of the measurements were final. I measured the board to see if it would be enough material for the build. Probably won't be enough, but I'll wait and see before cutting another board. So I cut the board at these notches to give myself a nice square middle section to work with. And going off my sketch, I cut sections that were 2 feet in length to help mitigate waste. These pieces will be used for the top of the tray. However, 3 boards was way too wide. But if I were to rip a small section for the middle, the width would be perfect. So I updated my sketch and set up the planer. Although my sketch had a 1-inch thickness for these boards, I kind of just planed them until the surfaces were clean and then stuck with that for the thickness. The board sections turned out really nice and had a nice reclaimed look to them. This one board on the bottom almost looks like 2 different pieces the way the cracks split and aged the wood. A lot of these boards had surface cracks that fortunately didn't penetrate too deep into the wood. Although not a huge issue, I still didn't want my cuts to fall on one of these cracks, so I worked my measurements around them. I traced out usable cuts for each of the boards, avoiding any major notches or cracks. The third piece for the top of the bench was divided up into 2 2-inch pieces and 1 middle piece that was a little over 1 inch thick. I set up a track for my circular saw and then ripped these sections of the board. I continued cutting all the usable sections of wood and trimmed them to the right length. Once all the pieces were cut, I numbered each of the segments on the sketch and on the wood itself, just so I didn't get them mixed up. After labeling all the cut pieces, I realized I was still short 2 boards though. This extra segment was too short, so I'll probably just use this as a test piece to practice my tendons on. So I ended up grabbing another board and cut one last piece out. After I planed the previous boards, I never adjusted the final thickness, so I'll use a piece of wood as a hard stop to make sure the thickness is the same. Unfortunately, the piece I planed had a large break in the wood, so I'll have to work around this fracture. Following the same procedure as before, I measured around the imperfection and cut out the usable 2-inch segments. I then numbered these boards and started to lay out the rough shape of the dog food tray. I impress myself sometimes with how good I am at math. Fortunately, I had too much material, so I could always just cut it down. Before I fix the length of these pieces, I'll address the seams between the boards that make up the tray. I saw a video of someone using this trick to get seamless glue up, so I figured I would give it a try. Time to break out the old sketchy table saw. Essentially what I'm doing is using the smaller pieces on top to hold these 3 boards together while I run a cut down the seams. This should hopefully result in a seamless joint between the boards. And waiting forever for the blade to stop. And here's the results of the cuts. Time to see how well they join together. Oh yeah, old sketchy table saw for the win.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
Time to glue them up. As with most glue ups, I brought the pieces inside to prevent issues caused by temperature changes. Unfortunately, the temperatures here plummeted and we got our first snowfall halfway through this project. So hopefully going from inside back outside doesn't mess with the boards too much. I also sprinkled on some fine cedar sawdust to help hide the seams. After that, I then clamped the rest of the boards down. The joints were seamless, however, a crack had formed in the center segment. But since I'll be cutting out most of the center for the food bowls, I'm not too worried about these causing any issues. While the glue up dried, I went back outside to clean up the edges of all the legs and supports. With all the pieces cleaned up, it was time to start making the tenons. Being relatively new to woodworking, I wanted this project to be more of a practice project to work on using mortise and tenon joints. I also wanted to practice using hand tools a bit more instead of drilling out all the mortises. Ended up finding an old back saw to practice cutting the tenons with. The cuts turned out okay. Unfortunately, the saw's a little warped, and that paired with my inexperience, the cuts walked a little bit. Although the cuts were not perfect, I figured I could still use the practice. Worst case, I could always clean them up with the miter saw. Yeah, I totally switched over to the miter saw. The cuts were not coming out great at all. I plan on picking up some new hand tools and saws in the near future, so I'll definitely be getting more practice with cutting material by hand. Oops, forgot to put a spacer block behind the leg. There we go. I went through and cleaned up all the tenons with the miter saw. And here's a better look at how badly I walked the handsaw when cutting. I'm going to lower the blade and clean these up a little bit more. Yeah, that's much better. Not perfect, but it'll definitely work. I then cleaned up the shoulders of the tenons with a chisel so they would sit flush against the tray. The next day, the glue up was dry and the top was ready to be sanded. The surface cracks had definitely become more pronounced. If I wasn't going to cut the majority of these out, I probably would have filled these with TiteBonded sawdust during the glue up. This definitely would have been a bigger issue if the cracks extended all the way through the boards. Before sanding, I used a scraper to remove the majority of the dried glue, that way it wouldn't clog up the mesh of the sandpaper. I sanded both sides of the top at 120 grit to help even out the surface. I then switched over to 220 grit for a smoother finish. Once sanded, I brought the board into the garage to square off all the sides. With the top squared up, it was time to start laying out the mortises. To avoid mixing up the legs, I numbered all the tenon shoulders and transferred those numbers to the mortise walls. Typically, you wouldn't have to do this because all the mortises and tenons should be equal, but since I'm still new, I figured the joints would most likely have some variation to them. Now, I could have easily drilled these holes out and squared them up, but I want to get more practice in with hand tools, so I'll be chiseling out these mortises. I mistakenly started with the mallet when I didn't need to for this wood, and although I didn't notice this at the time, the wood was starting to split. Oblivious to this, I continued outlining the opening of the mortise and started removing material layer by layer. I plan on getting some mortise chisels soon. These were the only chisels I had, so I'll be using these for the time being. It wasn't until the first test fit that I noticed the break on the outer wall. Cedar is a soft wood, and using the mallet was overkill, especially this close to the edge of the board. Since this is a practice piece, though, I taped the edges to hold the wood together and just planned on gluing down any breaks that may occur. Aside from the break, the first joint actually fit very well and was nice and snug. I continued on chiseling out the rest of the mortise openings, and only used the mallet if there were knots or any tough spots in the wood. Of all the joints, the first two had breaks on the sides, but they weren't too serious. The fact that I didn't blow through the sides on all of them shows a little bit of progression, I guess. So I assembled all the legs and began measuring out the supports. This is my intended layout for the supports, obviously just a little bit higher up on the legs, probably about halfway. I measured the supports on center with the legs and cut them to length. I then measured out all the tenons for these two pieces and then cut them with the miter saw. I used the dog food bowls as a quick gauge for the height of the supports. Once cut out, the rim of the bowls would be resting on the surface of the top board, so the supports would not actually be in contact with the bowls. Once I had my marks, I traced out the mortises for the legs and began chiseling them out. Learning from my mistake on the first set of mortises, I braced the sides of the mortise with the other legs to help support the walls while I chiseled out the material, and this seemed to work a lot better. The first fit was a success, and there was no breaks or cracks. Once the joints were completed, I began laying out the joints for the crossbeam. Yeah, I cheated on this one and used the miter saw for the tendons again. Like I said, once the new hand saws come in, I plan on using them a lot more. With the tendons cut, I followed the same process and laid out the cuts for the mortises. And then chiseled them out. By this point, I had started getting the hang of it and only relied on the mallet for tougher spots in the middle of the mortises. Seeing the slight progression actually made the process of doing these by hands a lot more rewarding and enjoyable. Well, that is until my math skills decided to make another appearance. Not sure how, but I was half an inch too long on the crossbeam and the joints didn't line up.
Ooh, that's not gonna fit. That's like a whole ½ inch off.
Time to redo the tenon on the crossbeam. All the joints were now lined up, but the table had a substantial wobble. I'm going to wait until everything is glued up, though, before I address the wobble. And while not perfect, I was actually happy to see all the joints line up and the piece start to come together. So I ended up bringing it inside to begin working on the repairs. While I wasn't a big fan of the round cut marks from the wood's previous use, seeing the tray assembled changed my mind, and I think they add more character to the reclaimed aspect of the cedar. Before repairing the mortises, I centered both food bowls and traced an outline for the cut marks. I did this mainly to double check if any of the cracks needed to be filled during the repair process. Fortunately, the cracks that would remain were nothing major, so I decided to leave them alone. With the lips traced, I used a compass to make a cut line that was about 1 inch shorter in diameter. And unfortunately, my pencil wouldn't fit in the compass, so I had to trace it after. But before cutting out the openings, I had to address the mortise breaks. If this wasn't a practice piece and I was making this for someone, I definitely would have redone the top board. But for the time being, I just used some TiteBond 3 to repair these breaks. I let these repairs sit for about 24 hours before continuing on with the project. The repairs turned out great, so it was time to start cutting out the openings for the dog food bowls. For this, I'll be using a jigsaw. I placed painter's tape over the base plate of the jigsaw to prevent any scratches or grooves in the wood. The base plate on mine is pretty beat up. And one down, one to go. The holes were pretty clean, although there was definitely a decent amount of splintering. To fix this, I'll sand the openings with 220 grit on the sanding sponge. I first added a slight chamfer to the edges of the cuts, and then sanded the exposed grain on the insides. Time for the test fit, and perfect. They were both perfectly centered, and they fit nice and snug in the round openings. After the final cuts, it was time to glue all the joints together. I used a variety of clamps for this glue up. Looking back, I probably should have glued up the legs and supports separately first and glued this up in 2 stages, but I didn't think it was a huge deal. Although this clamp layout looks absolutely hideous, all the joints were actually addressed and it had a nice amount of pressure on them. The next day I removed all the clamps and checked to see how everything glued up. Not bad. Wow, that wobble was horrible. All the legs were the exact same length, so the top board definitely warped at some point. I think working on this piece both inside and outside in the cold garage might have had something to do with this. Before I address the wobble, I'll sand the entire piece at 320 grit for a nice smooth finish. Although not the best solution, I ended up sanding down the feet to eliminate the wobble. After I wipe the entire surface with a tack cloth, but before I seal the wood, I'll use my branding iron and add the logo to the bottom. And even though I did just mention the risk of working in various temperatures, I really didn't feel like setting off all the smoke detectors in the house. The branding didn't come out as clean as the last project, and I think that's because I heated it for the same amount of time as I did for the cherry wood. Cedar is much softer, and I didn't really account for this. The branding iron would definitely take some getting used to. I brought the piece back inside, and I actually like the natural look of the cedar, so I think I'm just going to use some warm ultra-flat polyurethane to seal the wood. I applied it in the direction of the grain with the rag. Looking back, you could really see how much the top board warped in these shots. This is definitely what was causing the wobble. After seeing this firsthand, I will definitely be working more cautiously with future projects and factor temperature change into my work routine. Moving along, I continued applying the polyurethane to the piece and then dabbed it along the open end grains. After I waited 24 hours for the polyurethane to cure and then lightly sanded the surface with 320 grit. I love Polly, but she makes an absolute mess when drinking water, so I made sure to put a couple of coats on the top piece to protect the wood. Once the polyurethane cured, the food tray was complete. I love the natural look of the cedar, and funny enough, it actually matches Polly's fur color perfectly. Although I was worried about the surface cracks at first, I grew to love it. I think it adds to the reclaimed aspect of the cedar. This project was a lot of fun, but I will definitely need more mortise and tenon practice before using them in a build for someone. Time to see what Polly thinks. Yeah, she didn't care. That's okay. She eventually warmed up to it, and I think the elevation will make eating and drinking less strenuous on her. Thank you all for watching. A full list of tools used will be linked in the description below. Please let me know in the comments if you have any advice or ideas on woodworking tips, or if you just have some cool future project ideas. Thank you.